All right. I think we're ready to get started again. Hang on. Let me turn the mic on. Before we start, we're starting with lesson 5, and we may have to quit just a little bit early in the afternoon. So we'll have a session now until noon. Then we'll take a lunch break, and then maybe an hour and a half or so for the remaining time today. So we'll see how far we get with lesson 5. Lesson 5 talks about the church and also the sacraments in the church. So first off, let's talk about the church itself, the doctrine of the church, and the reformation of the church. For roughly the first 20 years, when the Reformation first started, or 20 to 25 years maybe, the reformers really were seeking to reform the Roman Catholic Church, not to replace it. From 1541 onward, it became clear that the Roman Catholic Church would not reform itself. There wasn't any change coming. And the reformers had a decision to make. Either they had to live with the way the Roman Catholic Church was, or they had to leave it and set up their own alternate church model. When they decided to leave, then they had to justify why they were leaving. That was a huge step. There had only been, since the New Testament, there had only been one split within the church between the Western Church and the Eastern Church. And so this was a significant step. And the reformers were not excited about taking that step. The early church fathers, in fact, defended the idea that there was only one church, and to leave or divide or cause a schism in the church was a terrible sin. One of the sayings of the day was that outside the church, there is no salvation. Now, the Roman Catholic Church meant that by saying we control grace and we dispense grace how we want. And if you want that grace, you need to be in the church. Right? The reformers also talk about that. But they're saying, if you are a true Christian, if you are united to Christ, then you want to be part of Christ's body as well. And so you really do need to be part of a visible church. And so the reformers would say that, but it was a different idea in the Roman Catholic Church. We need to go way back in history to the early church fathers and talk about Augustine and the Donatist strategy or controversy. The Donatists were a group they were Christians, but Augustine was around after the real serious persecution of the church. And what happened in the early church was the Romans persecuted Christians. Many were killed. And all a Christian had to do to avoid a lot of that persecution was to deny the faith, to deny their Lord. There were some people back in that day that denied the faith and saved their lives. But when the persecution ended, those people said, we want back into the church. And the Donatists said, no, you denied the faith, you're going to stay outside the church. So the Donatists said, the Donatists, get that right, wanted what they called a pure church, filled with pure church members. Augustine said, you will always have tares among the wheat. Very biblical concept, right? Augustine said basically, you're never going to have a perfect church until Christ comes again, right? Sin will always exist until Christ returns. So an attempt to separate yourself from the church because of sinners in the church is improper. How many of you have ever heard the excuse of someone who said, I don't want to go to church because they're all a bunch of hypocrites in the church?
All the time.
Yeah. Augustine said that's no excuse.
They're donatists.
Yeah, maybe they are. Right? Augustine even more specifically said, sin in the church is not a ground for schism. That's not a reason to split the church. Augustine said splitting the church, or he thought splitting the church was even a greater sin than living with sin in the church, or in any of the sin that was in the church. The problem for the reformers was, they read Augustine and they agreed with Augustine, but they saw the Roman Catholic Church as being so corrupt that it no longer taught the gospel. So now what do? It created a tension. On the one hand, the church had abandoned the grace of God that Augustine taught, but Augustine also said there's always going to be sinners in the church. So as the Reformation developed, there were really three different understandings of the church that arose. There was the Roman Catholic view. Let me put this, three different understandings of the church that arose. The Roman Catholic was a visible, institutional church. The church is what you see in the building down the street, right? It's the visible church. The radical reformers said it was an invisible donuts.
Donatist.
It was an invisible spiritual church. You can't see the church. It's just all those who are true Christians for the radical reformers. The magisterial reformers, it was a mix of visible, invisible. So let's talk about some of those different views. Let's talk about the Catholic view first. The Roman Catholic Church warned that any schism would bring dire consequences. If the church split, there wouldn't be any tradition to guide her. Because if you pull away from the Catholic Church, you pull away from all of its traditions as well. They said that it would lead the church to splinter into many different churches, all with their various own versions of a pope or own versions of leadership, own different church governments. And in some ways, they were right. How many denominations exist nowadays?
Yeah.
It's thousands, right? We all have our differences. They claimed, I'm just going to go underneath here. They claimed that the true church was found in visible structures. You can see the true church. They focused on priests and bishops. The clerics of the church were the representatives of the true church. And the secular laity weren't really part of the visible structure of the church. They attended Mass, but that was about it. Luther tried to find a way forward without splitting the church. But then the Colloquy of Regensburg in 1541, later confirmed by the Council of Trent in 1545, it was clear there was no reconciliation. And so they were forced to develop its own doctrine of the church, forced to develop its own church structures. Luther's, and that's what the second wave of reformers did, particularly Calvin. Luther did have some early reforms. All of the magisterial reformers accepted that the institutional Church of Rome of the medieval period was the true church. But they said at some point in that time period, the church became absolutely corrupt. And the foundation of its authority for the Catholic Church said, we can trace our history all the way back to the apostles, all the way back to Peter. The reformers came up with a different model. And in fact, Luther wanted a different model. They said doctrine is what keeps the church pure, right? Not the line of succession, right? Luther advocated some early reforms. He had a functional model of the church, as opposed to the Catholic institutional model. Catholic said the church is the institution. Luther said the church is defined by its function. Luther said the preaching of the word is a necessary function of the church. So for Luther, in this functional model, if you didn't have the preaching of the word, you weren't functioning as a church. Luther also said the church involved the laity. It wasn't just the priests that were the church. Luther talked about the priesthood of all believers. Right? Everybody in the church was part of the church. The only distinction between believers was the different work they had or the different offices they held, but they were all part of the church. Right? The radical reformers had a little different idea. They said they rejected the institutional church model of the Roman Catholic Church. They said the institutional Roman Catholic Church was never a true church. They said the true church is in heaven, and any form of earthly institutional church is a false church. They rejected the church fathers as unbelievers. Pretty rash thing to say, right? But they did. And when Luther saw what the radical reformers were saying, he tried to distance himself from the radical reformers. So Luther said in his functional model, after he heard what the radical reformers were saying, he added the idea that the church must also be a visible, historical institution. What Luther was trying to get at was, the radical reformer says the church is only in heaven, it's a spiritual thing. And Luther said, no, a true church can exist right here, right now. in time and history. It's a fine thing to say, but it put Luther in a bit of a quandary. He distinguished himself from the radical reformers when he did that, but it was almost like a swing back to the Roman Catholic Church, because the Roman Catholic Church was saying, yes, the visible church, that's the church, right? So what do? How do you sort through all of that? Well, it took Calvin to come up with a true ecclesiology or a true theology of the church, right? So Calvin, in his second edition, in the 1539 edition of the Institute, said the true marks of the church were the preached word and the proper administration of sacraments. Now, if you come from a Reformed church, or if you've studied Reformed theology, you know that Reformed churches say there are three marks of a church, right? The preaching of the word, the administration of sacraments, and the proper exercise of discipline, right? Calvin didn't specifically state the exercise of discipline as a third mark of the true church. That's going to come later, particularly with the Belgian Confession, Article 29. But Calvin did view discipline as a necessary extension of the church's ministry of the word and sacraments. My theory, this is just a personal theory, my theory was that when Calvin was in Geneva, he wanted very distinct roles of the church and the magistrate. And for Calvin, the magistrate was the one who enforced discipline, right? And so I think he was probably still working through that and saw a greater role of the state than what we would probably see in our churches today. But that's my own personal opinion, all right? I'm guessing that's kind of where it came from. Calvin also argued, I'm going to have to clear this, he argued for a distinction between a visible and invisible church. He said the church is the visible community of believers in a specific location. And within that group, within that visible church, is an invisible number of elect. The visible church is comprised of both the elect and the non-elect. There are Christians and there are non-Christians that exist in the visible church. And Calvin's model became the standard for the Reformed Church. It quickly became a powerful institution. It was a major opponent of the Roman Catholic Church. So, Dr. Zug is going to summarize the various views of the church. And he does it this way. He talks about the visible, institutional, magisterium, which for Calvin, that was the priestly model based on the separation of priests and lay people, kind of the Roman Catholic model, all right? There's also the functional model. That's the model developed by Luther, and it had limited focus on the institution itself. Melanchthon was also very flexible on this. He called these church models adiaphora, or things to the side, right? There was also the anti-institutional model, which would be the radical reformers And then there was Calvin's model of the visible and invisible church. Calvin linked the visible and the invisible church with a demand that a certain form was present in the visible church, even though it contained part of it as the invisible church. Dr. Zug also asked a question about this time. I'm curious what you would think. If someone only believed there was only a visible church, or if it was only an invisible church, are there consequences for how you set up the church when you do that? Yeah. Yeah. What kind of consequences would you see?
Can you ask a question again?
If there's only a visible church, what would that look like? Like the Roman Catholic Church, right? An emphasis on external functioning of the church, an emphasis on the buildings of the church even. If you only focus on the invisible church, do you care about church buildings? No, not really.
Online.
Online. Yeah. Yeah.
Online Baptist Church. Online Reformed Church.
Yeah, so one's ecclesiology matters as far as how you do church as well. And so Calvin's idea of the visible church is necessary, but the invisible church is inside that visible church. It's a really important concept, I think, with how we do church today. All right, any questions about the church and the Reformed idea of the church?
Sir,
Yes.
is it possible that since Augustine did not left the Roman Catholic Church, so what he said about the church is in the context of being a Roman Catholic, that it's unpardonable sin to
split.
split.
Because that's what happened. Even in Augustine's day, there was a Donatist church that worshipped so close to his church that he could hear them singing. Yeah. And there was a big split between there were Donatist congregations. In fact, there's a theory that one reason why Islam was able to conquer northern Africa as easily as it did, because the Donatist controversy weakened the church in that part, especially in North Africa, and the church just couldn't stand up against it. And Augustine is probably right. Church splits are never a healthy thing. Sometimes it has to be. But it should be done with great care and concern. It really should. You don't split a church because one person wants blue carpeting in the church and one person wants red carpeting. Yeah.
In the question from somebody, in the idea of church in the Reformation, can you call, how important are the office bearers? Can you call it a church, a local church without office bearers?
A good question. Can you have a local church without office bearers?
Say ministers, elders and deacons.
Ministers, elders, and deacons. I'll give you the standard Reformed answer, all right? This may be different in other churches, but even when you're planting a church, there needs to be oversight from office bearers of a church. And so when there's a young church, when there are not local elders or local deacons or a local minister of the word, then a neighboring church exercises oversight over that planted church until that church becomes what's called in Presbyterian circles particularized, right?
So for us, it's instituted.
Instituted, yes, yeah. Once enough leadership arises in that local church where elders can be assigned, at least 2 elders. Elders are more significant for the organization of the church, in Reformed churches anyway, than even deacons. Elders can take on the deacon role if they need to as well. You need at least 2 elders, but then a church can be institutionalized. Then it can be run on its own, even without a minister of the word. There are many churches that are vacant that don't have a minister of the word, but if you have at least a plurality of elders, 2 elders, that can be a functioning church. And before that, elders from another church oversee what's going on. The reason that's done is because you can have all kinds of Bible studies calling themselves a church, but they can go off in all different kinds of directions. If you have someone who's been ordained as an elder, that person through his faith and life has already shown that he is a solid, mature Christian. And you need solid, mature Christians to exercise leadership in any church congregation. I don't know, is it different with other churches, other denominations?
Somehow.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
If you're a bank manager and you're very good in talking and you can gather, and then you're a church.
Yeah.
So basically the invisible and the visible, it's like what they call now the universal and the local versus the local, where some say that I think one of the consequences of like believing only in the local church and not the universal or the invisible church is that they would not consider other denominations as brothers, as Christians.
Oh, that's true.
There are many Baptists who say that they are the only true church. The only true church is the Baptist. Others, like evangelicals, they won't accept it because they don't believe in the universal church, the invisible, but only in the visible, the local church only. That is one consequence.
That is a consequence. Yes. And there are Christians who think that we're the ones who have it right, and they don't recognize other churches, which is sad. It is sad. Yeah, I personally think we need to be much more proactive in seeking fellowship with churches of other denominations, like-minded churches, and we can have very, very close relationships with some, maybe more distant relationships with others, but we ought to at least recognize that the true gospel is being preached in many different churches, many different denominations, and we ought to praise the Lord for that.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's crazier to be on the universalist only when you think that the true church is the invisible and the visible, and you will accept everybody as brothers as long as they say they're church.
Yeah.
As long as they say they preach in the Bible.
Yeah.
And they believe in Jesus, they're brothers.
Yeah.
Practical question from
Yep.
someone also. The situation is there's a church with teaching false doctrine, and then 2 elders had to leave to start a new group,
Okay.
and they don't have a neighboring church to oversee them. What would be your suggestion?
I have a hard time seeing where that would actually be an issue. It may be But even if the elder oversight is exercised over a long distance, there still should be some sort of oversight.
Yeah.
There are some. I know one church being planted in Italy, where the elder oversight is in the United States. They do things a lot nowadays. You can do things online, and so on. That's not the ideal situation. Ideally, you would have a neighboring church, and you would assign elders to even participate in worship services in that the church being planted. So it certainly isn't ideal, but no church arises in a vacuum. Yeah, every church, there has to be some solution where you have that kind of oversight. Yeah. Now, I think she said, or the question was, if they had to leave a church, if there were two elders that left along with it, then they have a church right then. That elder oversight is already present in that planted church, if there are already ordained elders that are part of it.
But would you suggest that there has to be some sort of formality, meaning, how would I say that? There should be formal, meaning doesn't just like you assume things. It has to be, it would help that there should be delineation of clarity of the purpose of how things work.
It should be, yes. I know when churches in my federation, if they would do something like that. In fact, my federation had to leave another denomination. And when that happened, all the churches that left, they left with elders in place, but they drew new articles of incorporation for that particular congregation, saying this is a particular congregation, and this is how the congregation will be governed. Yeah. Does that answer it?
He says thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, and you can follow up on questions as well if you want. We are about to embark on a new section of the Sacraments, and I see it's like 15 minutes to 12. I wonder if we shouldn't take off a little early for lunch and maybe come back a little early, and then we can start on that new section on the Sacraments after lunch. So let's break for an hour, come back at 1:45, 12:45.